Mr. President, Mark, thank you very much for the honor to speak together with so many distinguished guests in such an interesting format. To be honest, it's not my favorite format to be part of a chain of monologues in which we test the stamina of the audience to listen to more or less concentrated presentations. And if you're not a gifted musician with entertaining qualities, I thought it's probably better to not prepare a dense speech, but rather make a few comments on what I found interesting to reflect on from an academic point of view, which makes it even harder if you only have 15 minutes to do this, because it can either be trivial or it can be too abstract, and that's the déformation professionnelle of professors, that they escape to very abstract or idealistic perspectives, and that isn't helping either to stay concentrated or to take something away as food for thought. So when I looked at the title of our panel, and it says, Restoring Multilateralism, Challenges and Global Power Shifts, I thought that we don't have to reinvent the wheel. Multilateralism is so self-explanatory good that it helps to buffer conflicts of interests and imbalances that exist all around the world, that creating a system that is rule-based is so obviously a positive thing that I don't even understand the dichotomy that was sometimes brought up in the comments and in the introduction by the moderator, that there's either multilateralism or a multipolar system. Because when we look at the interests of the different poles, all of them can't wait to create a multilateral system. The main difference simply is that the system should be run under their rules. So what we find is not so much either this or that, but a question of how can we make the world more fair, and that's like beauty in the eye of the beholder, a system that represents different viewpoints that are all very culturally based. And that's why cultural diplomacy plays such an important role, that we have to think of what makes a national interest and how does it reflect the different circumstances and contexts if we just believe that the world as it is, and Hans Köckler made a very good case in highlighting how unfair the world in its existing world order represented in the United States, in the United Nations currently is, in some sort of an extended Pax Americana, that this is far from being considered fair, and that explains a number of the conflicts that are currently described as a clash of different positions and a multipolar system. So a lot of this has to do with fear of change. And this fear of change is a topos that you find not only in the analysis that we just got about the functioning or dysfunctioning of a global order, but it's also something that we witness in different societies. For example, in my country, I come from Germany, elected a reform-oriented government, and a lot of people seem to believe that if I just tick the right box and I vote for reform, then it's automatically falling into the right place and we get reform and it doesn't bother me or I don't have to face costs. This is not how reform and change is happening, because it comes always with a price. No matter what we do politically, it has redistributional consequences. And the redistributional consequences are unfair, or at least those who are in privileged positions, and that applies both to the 5 permanent members of the Security Council as it does in the Western world in the way it is perceived in the Global South, comes with privileges that are challenged when we talk about the redistributional consequences of change. So it doesn't help if we are just afraid of change, because change is a reality. There is no such thing like the end of history or a system that is set in stone, because global power shift is happening as power shifts within societies. And when we think political, it's a challenge for politicians or everyone in the driver's seat to do the right thing, to moderate, and most importantly, communicate the consequences of this change. So of course, it's not enough to just say it, but also to do the right thing to address the consequences. And here comes the problem with the very practical consequences of who's in the driver's seat, who has privileges, who has what kind of voting power, who has access to institutions, and all the nitty-gritties of balancing a system of power politics that goes beyond our commitment of if we only communicate with each other, then the world will be a better place. So what I took from the heavyweights and the oral history panel that we listened to before the coffee break was a lot has to do with humans. If politicians do the right thing, then they can even bridge a dysfunctional system of institutions. I think it's fair to highlight this. We have a number of examples, but we can also turn around the argument and say without a functioning institutional system, it's not enough to just count on the leadership of gifted humans who guide us into a bright future. So a lot of the analysis, and I think this is also part of the problem of talking about complexity of that caliber in 15 minutes, is that we tend to focus on one thing and ignore others. And that, we had a discussion yesterday after dinner, often leads to a very biased perception of what we consider reality. If we only connect a few dots and ignore others, then we only see what we want to see. And this is also something that can be addressed by a more intense and open-minded form of communication to get to know each other and understand why someone perceives reality in a different way, because reality is not just what we measure, reality is also how we talk about it. And in fora like this, where we all come with our different cultural luggage, we certainly talk about realities in a different way. And again, it doesn't help if we are guided by fear, because fear is a bad advisor. So that brings me to a more practical example and something I know a bit more about, because that's my field of interest, which is the European Union. The opportunity to speak here in Northern Macedonia, in a country that is not just on paper a candidate country for joining the European Union, is a perfect test case to see how multilateralism might work in the nearer future. And the thing with multilateralism in practice in the format of the European Union is that it is a constant process of change. So it's not as set in stone as Hans Köckler pointed out what the current problem with the United Nations is, but we are constantly reinventing the rules of the game in this system of the European Union. Britain just left. Sorry about that, especially to our speakers from Scotland who we miss already. But this changed not only the internal power politics, but also the exogenous factors like the elephant in the room, the war in Ukraine, which I just checked it when I was sitting here, is as far away from here to Odessa as the northern border of Germany to the southern border, which feels like very close. And so while we are speaking here, people are dying, and we were so obsessed with our idea of our model of multilateralism is so wonderful and working that there is no alternative to it. And sooner or later, everyone wants to join, and then we are also interconnected and embedded, that we don't need to think about regional conflicts and the execution of power or massive violations of international law until it happened. And now we appear unprepared and frantically try to get prepared, with all the negative consequences that it comes with shifting resources from what is urgently needed to be addressed, like climate change, to our ability to create something like strategic autonomy or other variations to be more resilient for future crises. But it also opened a window of opportunity for further EU accession. And this is something interesting to look at because it changes the attitude that I witnessed when we discussed eastward enlargement of the European Union, in which especially a very law and rule and regulation oriented society like the German thought we are the norm and everyone has to become like the norm, and it's all about in a rule-based system that everyone applies everything in the same way, no matter what the starting conditions are. Now we learned the hard way that this is not working because you cannot transform Northern Macedonia overnight into something like a super functional system like Switzerland or Germany or Denmark or whatever, but we are still committed to offer countries like yours an opportunity to join the club, because this is not only a modernization strategy to guide you into a more socioeconomic, brighter future, but also the feeling of belonging is something that we see in the case of Ukraine, makes a big difference, and that explains why Ukraine has been attacked and not Lithuania or other countries that belong to NATO or the European Union. So what I think is a lesson to be learned from opportunities like here and also the follow-up opportunities in the dialogue between candidate countries from Western Balkans and the European Union is not just about what we discussed yesterday in your office. If the European Union would fund us a modernized infrastructure, then we would be better off. But to vary the famous quote from John F. Kennedy, what can I do for my country? And I think this is something that is missing a lot in the discourse because we don't know much about Northern Macedonia, and we all have these stereotypical pictures about what is not working on the Balkans, because that doesn't win the hearts and minds of people in the European Union. And this is something that is urgently to be addressed, because it's not just about leaders who decide, let's get them in more sooner than later, because then we make them part of our system of norms and values, but also to pay attention to who's coming and what do they bring to the table. And this, what they bring to the table, was something we also discussed yesterday when you highlighted the rich cultural experience with long periods of peace if you create an open space. But the open space is no longer what it used to be during the Ottoman Empire. The open space is something that comes with a truck full of norms and rules and regulations. And the question is, how do we deal with this in a form of not only changing the countries that apply for membership by fulfilling the Copenhagen criteria, because these are apparently not something that can be discussed. You have to be a Western-type democracy, you have to fit into the economic system of the European Union, and you have to implement the legal system, the rules, what makes the rule of law the rule of law. But it can't be the same sort of standard model if we understand that the situation here is very different from elsewhere, which means that most likely the European Union will become something different in a more differentiated way. But that makes it even harder to communicate back home what the benefits of joining the European Union is, because you apply for something that is in constant transformation. And at the same time, you are in transformation, and we in the European Union, in our different positions to communicate publicly what this whole thing is about, because apparently this was missing in Britain when people did not even fully understand what they were voting for. So two moving targets, countries that are different from the country that applied for membership is different from the one that one day will join something, while the European Union is in transition, because when we only look at the sort of core pillars of what everyone highlighted about the nature of the European Union, it was mostly about austerity, free trade, and competition policy. When we now look at the current discussions in the European Union, it's not so much about free trade anymore, because there are reasons to think about supply chain management and protectionist instruments. The competition policy is also a matter of debate, because we have to get our battery factories and all kinds of things that we rather take home in order to be more resilient. And last but not least, the question of, can the European Union be indebted? And this is a new way of financing, for example, the Next Generation EU Fund is something that used to be a taboo when we discussed for a long time whether Euro bonds are a good idea or not. So the EU is changing a lot. The Western Balkans is expected to change on the one hand because you want to modernize, and on the other hand because you wouldn't get in without a substantial transformation that is a necessary requirement. But at the end of the day, it will become something that can only work if all the different factors, like the right institutional set, the right ideas, and paying attention to conflicting interests and power is sufficiently addressed. And this is first and foremost the task of cultural diplomacy, not just by happy events in which we make music or exchange pieces of art, but culture in the sense of understanding our different cultures, where we come from, and what we all bring to the table as the potential that makes Europe European, which is its richness in cultural diversity. So it's not about harmonizing everything all over the place, but learning from the positive experiences that are perfectly represented in your country. So it couldn't be a better choice to reflect on the next step and a reinvention of the European integration project than here. Thank you very much for organizing this, and thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to share my thoughts with you. Thanks.